Well, thank you for filling out those forms. I do read every single one of them, so if you wrote comments on the back, I appreciate getting those. It always helps to redesign the class as needed. Okay, today we're going to have just a general overview of the whole course, going through everything we've learned. I think you'll find it amazing how we can now summarize things in a very succinct form, now that you've gone through it in detail, and things kind of come through in a much more crystalline fashion. And so that's what I'm going to try to do, is show how the topics we've covered can be actually reduced to relatively few concepts, which then added on top of each other give you all the results that we're looking at. So I want to do that first with micro and then with macro. With micro also, I want to provide a very interesting application of how to handle public goods and externalities using automobiles as the example. So before that, the main topic in microeconomics is how do markets operate, and how do the different structures of market result in beneficial or unbeneficial social outcomes. The topic actually can be reduced to two issues. The first one is, we'll just go through them in competition and then show how all the other ways of looking at markets occur. The first question is there free entry and exit? And we know what free entry and exit means. It means firms can enter and leave when they want without incurring any additional costs relative to the firms that are already there, and they can leave and recoup whatever their costs are. If that's true, it's practically definitional that prices are eventually going to be driven down to average cost. If there's ever profits being made in the market, then firms will enter the market, and so the price will go down. And if profits are negative, firms will leave the market. So eventually, we're going to have to end up at a place where price is equal to average cost, and that's practically definitional. The other issue then is, if we know price, we can answer the question about whether there's free entry and exit. The next question is, how can each firm affect market price, or can each firm affect market price? And in a competitive environment, each firm is small enough in the market such that they know there's no way each firm could individually affect the market price. My uncle going into the wheat, taking his wheat to the market, he just takes whatever price is there, and if he tried to haggle for a higher price, they'd just tell him to go away. So firms in a competitive industry can't affect market price. What that translates into is that they just take the prices given and adjust how much they're going to produce until it's no longer profitable to produce more. And when does that occur? When their marginal cost has finally risen to price. So we have actually just two questions. What happens with entry and exit, and what happens with firms' ability to manipulate price, the market price? And in competitive industry, we get very specific answers for both. There's free entry and exit, and firms can't affect price. The answer to these two questions then tell us everything there is to know about competition. First of all, just by the definition of marginals and averages, we know that since price is equal to average cost and price is equal to marginal cost, that means these two have to be equal to each other. And the only place average cost is equal to marginal cost is at the minimum of the average cost curve. This is not an economic concept. This is just a definitional concept for any marginals and averages. If the average is equal to the marginal, then they have to be at some minimum or maximum. In this case, it's a minimum. So we know that price is eventually going to go right there at the minimum of the average cost curve, where we know the marginal cost curve cuts through it. Again, that's just definition of what the marginal cost curves are. And then if we wanted to look at what happens in the market as a whole instead of each individual firm, this information just gets transferred over to a market graph and fills in the rest of the information. We know that the price is going to end up at the minimum of the average cost curve, where marginal cost is equal to average cost. And if price is there, the market demand curve tells us how much is going to be produced in the market altogether. So the market demand curve is only there to tell us the total amount produced in the industry, because we already know what price is going to be. Price has to be at the minimum of the average cost curve. And then as soon as we know what the total amount produced in the market is, we can know how many firms there are in the market, because this quantity divided by that quantity has to be the number of firms in the industry. So it's actually, everything follows definitionally from those first two issues of is there entry and exit, and can firms manipulate prices? And those are questions that you can answer intuitively. You don't have to think, is this competitive? Is this not competitive? Is this whatever market it is? Those are questions that have real meaning, and you can talk about them as being met to some degree or not. And that's what happens in all of these industries. Okay, so now let's apply that concept to monopolistic competition. So in monopolistic competition, you have lots of firms producing similar products, but each one is somewhat different. So what it means is that each firm can raise their price some and not lose all their customers. Automobiles is a great example. This is a case where if Toyota was to raise its price, not everyone would switch over to Honda immediately. They'd still have some people that like the Toyotas. But we still have free entry and exit. And so we answer the first question, yes, there's free entry and exit. The definition of monopolistic competition is that new firms can enter, create products, and have access to inputs just like the existing firms. This is going to lead to price equal to average cost, as always, for free entry and exit. However, because each firm now knows that it can raise its price, it has the ability to raise price. In a competitive situation, each firm is so small, if it tried to raise its price above the market price, no one would buy from it. My uncle takes his wheat to the combine or wherever it is, and they just tell him no, they won't buy it. But for monopolistic competitive firms, they each have a unique product, and so they each know they can raise their price some and still get away with it. And what does that mean? They're going to do it. They're going to raise their price a little bit above marginal cost. How much above marginal cost is determined by a variety of factors. But we do know they're going to raise price above marginal cost because they can. Now, the actual calculation of how much above it is going to depend on, as we worked out, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and the slope of the demand curve telling you how much marginal revenue is below price. But those are kind of, again, definitional issues. They're the definition of what profit maximization is and a definition of the relation between marginal revenue and marginal cost. The main idea is if a firm can manipulate its price and get away with it, it'll raise its price. And that's what is causing price to be over marginal cost. So now we have these two questions answered in a different way, and all we have to do is combine this with our definitional information about cost curves to know what's going to happen. If price is equal to average cost and greater than marginal cost, that means average cost is greater than marginal cost. By definition of average and marginal, if the marginal is below the average is dropping. If your average grade point average is a B and you make a C in a class as your marginal extra grade, it's going to bring down your average. So this is simply the answer to the previous two questions, and that implies that we're on the downward sloping part of the average cost curve. If we're on the downward sloping part, we're not at the minimum. We're somewhere over here. So again, answering those two questions tells us exactly everything we need to know. And since we know that price is going to be equal to average cost at that point, we know the demand curve has to be tangent at that point. There's no other possibility. So again, we looked at this previously, kind of building up these concepts, but now it's clear that they actually refer simply to two ideas. Can firms enter and leave? And can a firm manipulate its price? Everything after that is simply using the definitional concepts of what marginal and average, how they have to relate to each other. We have one other market, monopoly. And it's interesting because neither of those two questions gets answered in the yes. Is there free entry and exit? No, which means that the price will be over average cost. There could be profits in this industry and nothing's going to happen. No firms are going to enter to take those profits away. I always say that it ends up with price over average cost because if a monopolist was losing money, it would just go out of business. So free entry and exit can't really disallow the possibility of a firm going broke. So the firms that actually end up in the market are going to have price over average cost. The rest of them, monopolists, run out of business. So price will be over average cost. The monopolist is the only one selling its good, and so it knows it can manipulate its price. It can raise its price, and some people are going to still buy the good. It has the ability because it's the only seller of the good, and so it will. It'll price greater than marginal cost. But now we have a situation where there is really no information about the relation between average and marginal cost because price is greater than both of them. That's all we know, is price is greater than both of them. So we can draw any graph we want for a monopolist. The only restriction is that the demand curve has to be above average cost, otherwise there won't be zero positive profits somewhere. And yet beyond that, we could either be on this side where the average cost curve is downward sloping. We could be, if the demand curve is way up here, we could be over here on this side where it's on the upward sloping side. So the fact that there's no relation between, that the answers to those questions tell us nothing about the relation between average cost and marginal cost, tells us we don't know where on this graph we're going to be. All we know is that the demand curve for the good has to be above average cost somewhere, and then everything else is just definitional to where on that demand curve the firm will be. So it's interesting. Monopoly is looks like a very precise concept because you've got all these intersections of marginal revenue, marginal cost, read up to the demand curve to get the price. But it's the market of the three that actually has the least information about it. You don't know the relationship between average cost and marginal cost in this relationship. You could either be where marginal cost is above average cost or on the other side, just depending on where things happen to fall. The only requirement is that there's a positive profit. So that explains our markets. You can then, of course, generalize this to allow for all the in-between situations where they're kind of free entry and exit, not completely, and all of it just falls through from that. So it's all very interesting. Now, the second major topic we talked about, or the second kind of set of topics we talked about, is ways in which markets fail. And the main examples we had were externalities and public goods. Externalities, markets fail because the individual parties to the transactions do not bear the full costs and benefits of the good. And public goods fail mainly because people aren't willing to reveal their willingness to pay for a public good, and there's no way to extract that information through a market. You can maybe do it, as we've described, through ballot propositions, but not through markets, because the same good is purchased by everyone. Cars is a great example of this situation. And our treatment of policy towards automobiles actually is a great example of how one can appropriately handle these kinds of market failures. It's probably, it's not clear that it arose through that our policies arose through a clear thinking of how these things relate to public goods and externalities. But I think the fact that it stayed that way and there's still continued support for these policies about vehicle use is because it actually solves these problems in a very interesting and unique way. So what about automobile use? What's involved with it that can cause markets to fail? First one is externalities. We all know there's tons of externalities associated with vehicle use. There's the pollution, global warming, the CO2, which goes up into the atmosphere and eventually will heat up the earth. There's the local toxins, which are particulates, and if people breathe them, it can make your respiratory system not work too well. There's also dependence on foreign oil, which puts us at a risk despite what I said about interdependence causing peace, it still is a bit bothersome that our economy and our AS curve depends so much on the flow of foreign oil. And there's congestion. Anytime a person drives in congested conditions, they consider their own cost, but they don't consider the cost they impose on everyone else. So there's all these externalities that we want to take into account, and a freely operating market would clearly create too much vehicle use and too much gasoline use. The second thing is that roads, which we use to drive on, are public goods. The road, Bay Bridge that gets me into San Francisco, you can use the same Bay Bridge. We don't have to have our own Bay Bridges. We all get to use the same roads. So they're a public good, and we have the obvious problem of how to price those public goods, or how to decide how much to produce and how to allocate the costs of them. If we went and asked everyone how much they'd be willing to pay to build the roads, as we've described, everyone would say, I'm not willing to pay anything, because you know your answer wouldn't affect the final result, and yet by saying nothing, you would not be having charged anything. So we need some way to deal with this. And the form in which we've done it for automobile use is actually an exceedingly good way to handle public goods, and becomes even a better way when there are externalities involved. So what we have for policies for automobile use is a gas tax, a very hefty gas tax. If you've ever looked on when you're buying gas, how much of the price is actually tax, it's exceedingly high compared to other goods. And we also have fuel efficiency standards for vehicles. These are called the CAFE standards, Corporate Average Fuel Efficiency Standards. These are requirements that Congress placed on manufacturers that all the vehicles that they produce have to, on average, meet a certain fuel efficiency level. There's also this new concept called feebates that I'm really in favor of. I'm not going to be able to talk about it today, but it's a matter of a new idea put forth by a student who was in this class, went to the Goldman School, ended up with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and now has, there are 3 states that have already passed this, and Congress is considering it. It's a matter of charging fees on vehicles that are inefficient and rebates on vehicles that are efficient. And so it tilts the prices. And the advantage of it is the fees you get on the inefficient vehicles are used to pay the rebates on the efficient ones. So it's not a tax. It's a great concept. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out. Debbie Gordon is her name. And it's kind of shows how you could still have big influence on fields that are quite well developed. Okay, so to talk about the 2 policies that we have, the gas tax and the corporate average fuel efficiency standards, and how they complement each other and work with respect to the public good and externalities issues, I want to step back a little bit and talk about where gas consumption comes from. It comes both from the amount that we drive and the fuel efficiency, because the fuel consumption is the number of miles you drive divided by the miles per gallon, and that tells you how many gallons of fuel is consumed. This is a very strange concept, miles per gallon. It tells you how many miles you can go for a gallon, when usually you're interested in gallons per mile. How much gallons do you use to go a mile? So the idea is this has to be put in the denominator to translate it into gallons per mile. What this means is if you want to reduce the amount of gas consumed, there's 2 ways to do it. Reduce the amount that people drive, or increase the fuel efficiency of vehicles. Either of those 2 things. And the 2 policies that we have actually direct towards each of those 2. So the gas tax. What's interesting about the gas tax is that the revenues for it are specifically earmarked for road construction and maintenance. Remember, roads are public goods. And one advantage of this, or one aspect of it, is people pay in proportion of how much fuel they use, which is very highly related to how much they drive. So what this does is avoid the free rider problem. What it does is place a tax on a private good, that is a non-public good, a good that each person consumes alone. A gallon of gasoline that I consume, you can't consume. So it places a tax on gasoline, which is used to fund the public good. And the tax, the amount of the private good that a person uses, is exceedingly highly related to how valuable the public good is to you. People who drive a lot get more value out of the roads than people who drive very little. And so the gas tax is essentially a way of indirectly charging people for the roads in proportion to how much they use them, which is quite related to how much they're willing to pay to use them. So this is probably the best way you can fund public goods, is by finding a private good that is tied to it. The consumption of the private good is related necessarily to the public good, and then adding a tax to that, because that means that the amount you get from each person is going to be somewhat proportional to their willingness to pay for the public good. And that's what happens with the gas tax. It's a great solution for handling that public good procedure. Now, the problem with taxes normally, that's a good way to take care of the public good aspect of of roads. But the problem that we've seen with most taxes is that it moves us away from social efficiency, social optimality. Taxes generally do that. However, in the presence of externalities, that's not the case. In the presence of externalities, taxes actually move us towards social optimality. So the gas tax actually solves both of these two problems simultaneously. It raises price towards the social cost, and as you know, it's a hefty tax because the social cost of gasoline is considerably higher than the private cost. And the revenues from it are used to fund the public good. So it essentially is a unique and interesting way to solve both those problems at once, the externalities and the public good. What's the disadvantage of it? The disadvantage is that it really has exceedingly small effect on fuel consumption. It's good at moving things towards prices towards social cost and towards funding the public good, but it doesn't really reduce fuel consumption much. A 50%, there's been research on this a lot. I've done quite a bit of it myself. And the kind of midpoint estimate that people obtain is that a 50% increase in gas prices through taxation or whatever only result in about a 16% decrease in fuel consumption. And not only that, most of the reduction in fuel consumption comes from decreased driving rather than people buying more fuel-efficient vehicles. The price of gas goes up, people tend to just drive less. I mean, it's maybe hard for you to think of that because, you don't really think about the price of gas when you get in your car. But it is true. People just, it gets too expensive to take that trip up to Napa, or, they just don't have enough money to go to the gas tank and fill up, and so they just don't drive for a while. So there is a decrease in the amount that people drive. There's an extremely small increase in fuel efficiency. Okay? The problem with decreasing miles per gallon, we'd really like to reduce consumption of gasoline by increasing fuel efficiency instead of decreasing driving, because driving brings about benefits to people. We drive because we want to get somewhere, and that provides some consumer surplus to us. So decreasing VMT does indeed reduce gas consumption, but it has the harm of losing our consumer surplus. So it would be nice to be able to get some policy that attacks the issue more directly through miles per gallon. And that's what the corporate average fuel efficiency standards do. Corporate average fuel efficiency standards force manufacturers to meet an average fuel efficiency for all the vehicles that they sell, and the standard is different for cars and light trucks. So each one has an average, but they have to beat both of those average. The current standard is 26.5 for cars. It's going up next year for the first time since 1984, 82. The average fuel efficiency standard for cars is going up. Prior to the passage of this average fuel efficiency law, the average car in the United States, the average fuel efficiency was around 10 to 12 miles per gallon. If you think about how much fuel we would be consuming now if we still had those behemoth cars on the road, it's unthinkable. So this has been an exceedingly important policy, and it is, despite workings of free markets being good in most situations, given the huge externalities and market failures that can occur in a market for fuel consumption, it does seem that this kind of policy intervention has been and would be useful. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so that gets us through micro. We've got markets. We've got market failures and government intervention to try to bring us closer to optimality. Now we want to turn to macro. Again, I'm going to try to show how this all is far more concise than our lengthy lectures throughout this semester might have indicated it could be. We have 4 outcome variables that we're concerned with. What is the total amount produced in the economy? What is the interest rate? What are prices of domestic goods? And what's the exchange rate, which determines the price of imports in the United States and exports outside the United States, to outside the United States. And from a control perspective, what the government has to handle to be able to fine-tune and keep us going on a steady course for macroeconomic growth is the amount that we spend, the government spends, the amount that we tax people, that is, take money away from them and prevent spending, and the supply of money. The important thing is that each of these control variables affects each of the outcome variables, and each of the outcome variables depend on each of the other outcome variables. So it's important, this is the main lesson, I think, from macro, is that you have to follow all the pathways through and understanding only that the results start getting, or the changes start getting smaller and smaller the further you are on the path, till eventually you reach a new equilibrium. Okay, with that said, do y'all have this graph? I made this one up. This is the ultimate crib notes for macroeconomics. This sheet contains everything you've learned in macroeconomics in this class. I love it. So we have our 4 outcomes: aggregate output, interest rates, general price level, and exchange rates, and a graph that shows how each of them is determined. And then we have between these arrows that are causations. And each of them has a sign associated with that causation. Now, this is always a problem in math. What does a positive and what's a negative mean? In this case, I'm using positive to mean the things move in the same direction, and a negative to mean they move in the opposite direction. So what this means is that if aggregate output rises, that's going to cause the interest rate to rise. That's what this arrow right here says. Aggregate output rising, this will move in the same direction, cause interest rate to rise. The converse of that, of course, they're moving in the same direction, means that if aggregate output decreases, the interest rate decreases. So the first thing you want to do in going through this at home is go through every one of these arrows and see if you understand why that causation occurs. So for example, this one. Why is it that aggregate output causes the interest rate to rise? Somebody tell me. Oh, this is sad. Increased demand for money. Why do we have an increased demand for money? Because if people's income is higher, they're going to be buying more. And if they buy more, they have to have more liquid assets to buy with. That's what you buy with. And so an increase in Y necessarily causes the demand for money to rise, which causes the interest rate to rise. Okay? But now I've got an arrow going in the opposite direction, saying that if interest rates rise, output will drop, because these go in opposite directions. Or conversely, if interest rates drop, output will rise. So the negative means they go in an opposite direction. Why is that? If interest rates rise, how come aggregate output drops? Exactly. If interest rates rise, firms find it more costly to borrow, and hence they don't invest as much. And consumers find it less advantageous to save, and so they consume more. Both of those effects is to raise investment and consumption here, which raises aggregate output. Oh, wait. Did I say it backwards? I just said it backwards. Interest rate rises, that means firms will invest less, and consumers will save more because they get more money by loaning out their savings, and consume less. That'll cause investment and consumption to decrease, and hence that to go down. So you want to go through each of these pictures and see what the causation is. And all the stories that I've described so far can be explained in terms of moving through this whole graph, like aggregate output increases, that causes price to increase, that causes the interest rate to increase, that causes output to decrease, that causes interest rate to, you just keep going. The only thing this graph doesn't show you is how you ever reach the new equilibrium. And unfortunately, I have no mechanism for showing that. You just have to believe there is going to be a new equilibrium. That's, again, one of those. It's essentially a simultaneous equation system with 4 unknowns and 4 equations, and there is a solution to it. Each of these is an upward sloping and a downward sloping curve, and there is a solution that satisfies for any set of them the equilibrium. Notice that there are a lot of arrows missing. I don't have an arrow from general price level to aggregate output. And I don't have an arrow from general price levels to exchange rate, or from exchange rate back to there and back up here. That's not because they don't exist. It's because those are the arrows we haven't studied in this class. They're the ones that I consider to be secondary, and those are the ones that you can look forward to studying about when you get into 100B. But you might, when you're going through this graph, try to think through it yourself. What do you think a change in the exchange rate is going to do to the interest rate? And try to work through what you think the logic would be. Essentially, everything affects everything else, and all we do is move from one equilibrium to another, given some external shocks. And the external shocks that we can control are how much the government spends, how much taxation there is, and the supply of money. Okay, like this? I love it. Now, we can use this to examine fiscal policy and monetary policy, repeating simply what I've said before, just to push it, stronger in. If we have expansionary fiscal policy, we try to stimulate the economy by spending more or reducing taxes. That's going to increase output. It is going to increase output. It's going to have other effects, though, that make that increase less than we would otherwise have thought. First of all, it increases interest rates. That reduces the amount by which output increases, if you go back to that graph. It also means we're going to have less investment and hence less growth and hence less productive capacity in the future. So it means we're losing in the future for this short-term gain. We have higher prices. The amount of higher prices depends on how close we are to full employment. So part of the increase in output is eaten up in higher prices. And it causes the dollar to appreciate, which hurts our exports. That hurts our economy also. So essentially, we get one positive benefit, and we get 3 negative benefits, negative outcomes. That in itself should let you know this is something where you really don't want to do unless you have to. That's basically the story, I think, with fiscal policy. There is one other problem that's not on this graph that is often cited as a problem of fiscal policy, and that is if you engage in the standard form of expansionary fiscal policy, it necessarily increases the deficit. If you spend more without taxing, it increases the deficit. If you reduce taxes without reducing spending, it increases the deficit. And so not only do we have all these effects, but then we have a larger deficit that we somehow have to take care of in the future. We have to pay it back, and that means contracting our economy in the future to be able to pay back the amount. So that's an extra loss under standard form of expansionary policy. However, I hope I have convinced you there's actually an extremely effective form of expansionary policy that doesn't increase the deficit. No one will ever talk about it. It's the big hush-hush. Take from the rich and give to the poor. Truly. tax people who have high income and have a low marginal propensity to consume, don't spend most of it, and give it to people that have a high marginal propensity to consume, low income people who spend most of their money. This is exactly fits the model that we've been describing. What we want to move out of a period of low unemployment is for there to be more purchasing of goods and services. An effective way to do that is to take income away from people who don't spend it and give it to people who do. Now, I want to really say I'm in the percent that would be taxed highly under this concept. And so my belief is truly sincere. I mean, it's against my own interest, but I do think it's good for the world. So, and that, of course, if it's a pure transfer, then it doesn't increase the deficit. And in fact, I think most people would recognize that it would be acceptable if it was seen as a separate pot of money that is not used for any government services. So the people that complain about government taxation because it goes into the government and gets wasted, this is not being used by the government. It's just coming in with checks and being written out with checks, transferring money. The only disadvantage is whether high-income people have less of an incentive to work as a result of that. I don't believe that. I can't imagine quitting working just because I'm not making quite as much money. It's like, what are you going to do? Go to Hawaii and vegetate? You don't, you know, working's fun. The money is a byproduct. Okay, so that's fiscal policy. Monetary policy is much more positive when it works. Monetary policy increases output. That's what, of course, the expansionary aspect of this is. It decreases the interest rate, which means we get a greater investment now, which gives us greater productive capacity in the future. And so we have a win now and a win later. It does cause inflation. This is the only negative aspect of it, but the amount of inflation it causes depends on how close we are to full employment. And when when the Fed is operating effectively, or when monetary policy can operate effectively, we have found that it's relatively easy to keep inflation under control. This is what's happened over the last 20, 25 years, where the Fed has been really fine-tuning to where we move towards full employment till inflation pulls in, starts up, and then we pull back a little bit and keeping inflation under control. So this is not a difficult problem. It's really a problem that occurs when you get too close to full employment, and believe me, contractionary policy is a lot easier than expansionary policy. So this is the one possible negative, but I think it's manageable. Also, it causes the dollar to depreciate, which helps our exports. So we get 3 benefits and only one manageable disadvantage. The only problem with it is it's easy to implement, as I've said. The Fed does this on a day-to-day basis. We have an agency that's their purpose is to do it, unlike Congress and the administration, whose purpose is other things. And it's easy to time correctly. It's hard to predict, however, because the main effect is through the influence of interest rates on firms' investment decisions and consumers' consumption decisions. And those things keep changing. The relation between interest rates and those decisions keep changing. So it's hard to predict. As long as there is some effect, however, monetary policy can still be used, and the fact that it's hard to predict is counterbalanced by the fact that we can keep correcting things as we go along. The only time monetary policy doesn't work is when lowering interest rates just won't get people to invest more and won't get consumers to consume more, and then we have to go to fiscal policy. Okay. That's economics. Thank you. Let's give a hand to Vivian, our AV person.